morning. Our gospel reading this morning comes from Matthew chapter 13, verses 1 through 9, and then 18 through 23. Let us listen for the word of God. That same day, Jesus went out of the house and sat beside the sea. Such great crowds gathered around him that he got into a boat and sat there, while the whole crowd stood on the beach. And he told them many things in parables, saying, "Listen, a sower went out to sow, and as he sowed, some seeds fell on the path, and the birds came and ate them up. Other seeds fell on the rocky ground, where they did not have much soil, and they sprang up quickly, since they had no depth of soil. But when the sun rose, they were scorched, and since they had no root, they withered away. Other seeds fell among the thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked them. Other seeds fell on good soil and brought forth grain, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. Let anyone with ears listen. Hear then the parable of the sower. When anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what is sown in the heart. This is what was sown on the path. As for what was sown on the rocky ground, this is the one who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy. Yet such a person has no root, but endures only for a while. And when the trouble or persecution arises on account of the word, that person immediately falls away. As for what was sown among the thorns, this is the one who hears the word, but the cares of the world and the lure of wealth choke the word, and it yields nothing. But as for what was sown on good soil, this is the one who hears the word and understands it, who indeed bears fruit and yields, in one case 100-fold, in another 60, and in another 30. The word of God for the people of God. This passage is a pretty familiar one, but let's take a moment and see what we have here. The sower who has some seeds to be sown, and then there are a few kinds of ground, and it seems that there's only one kind of ground that produces a fruitful plant. When we hear this parable, we often think about the soil types and what type of soil we want to be. And most of us are certain we want to be the good soil. And we don't have to go much further than the evening news to find examples of the rocky ground, the path, or the thorns. It is easy to look around and find all kinds of soil. And perhaps at times it's easier to see the rocks and thorns in another person's soil than it is in our own. So let us suppose, though, that we all have a variety of soil types in us. We all have the potential to be good soil, but most of us have a few rocks or thorns here and there. Let's also suppose that the sower in this story is God. God is throwing that seed generously. The seed is abundant. There is no precise calculation about where the seed lands. It's just there, available to all types of soil. The sower casts the seed where it lands and lets it grow as it is able. What do we do with all this soil and all this seed? Do we just sit back and wait to see what God does with it? Do we work really hard on being the good soil in our own lives? Is it possible to look deep inside ourselves and find the rocks and thorns and to purge them? Are there ways to avoid being snatched up in the beak of a bird? In his explanation of the parable, Jesus says it's the evil one that snatches seed from the path, or it is the sun that scorches the new seedling, or the thorns that choke it. So what do we do? The story of Jesus doesn't end with his death and resurrection. It continues on in our Christian faith. We are followers of Jesus who believe that he came to bring reconciliation to us so that our brokenness can be made whole once again and we can be in harmony with God. As Jesus followers, we are called not just to believe the right things, but to do the right things through living our faith. We see in Micah 6:8, do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with your God. Our faith is a response to the grace and reconciliation we find in God and through Jesus. It sounds easy enough, but living a life of faith is hard work. It doesn't always come naturally to us. Earlier in Matthew chapter 5, Jesus tells us about who is blessed in the Beatitudes. The peacemakers, the meek, those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, those who mourn, the merciful, the pure in heart. These are people who are reaching outside themselves and tending to the soil all around them. In this part of the book of Matthew, Jesus is teaching often, sometimes through parables and through the Beatitudes, which were part of the Sermon on the Mount, and later in the Great Commission. In this teaching, we see that there is brokenness among humanity, a brokenness that Jesus has come to make whole. Jesus knows the seed, what God has to offer, is available to everyone. The rocks, thorns, and burdens are just part of our human existence. Things will get in the way of our being the good soil. Jesus in the Beatitudes is telling us about working not just for our own good or the good of our families, but the good of others who are in terribly hard places. We live in a broken world that desperately needs healing. It can feel rather overwhelming to be in the world and see the brokenness, to live in this brokenness. We might cry out, "Where do we start, Jesus? Where do we start? Widows, orphans, hunger, poverty, homelessness, inequality in access to education or proper health care. The list can just go on. If I am walking down the street and give some change from my pocket to a person begging on the corner, have I done what I was called to do? It does provide me with a few minutes of feel good, but I know I should go deeper. I can see this person as fully human. I can ask their name. I can hear part of their story. I can let their story dance with my story and see where we end up." In her book, Kitchen Table Wisdom, Dr. Rachel Naomi Remen writes, "Much recent medical research suggests that isolation makes us vulnerable to illness and that relationships further survival." Dr. Remen has worked as a medical doctor and in therapeutic practice with cancer patients. She also has extensive experience herself being the patient. Her experience has shown her that diseases like cancer are very isolating, and when people are together, and they have the freedom to say what they are experiencing and feel what they are feeling, that they find great healing for their spirit, and in turn, this helps heal the body. Later, she simply says, "Community heals." While her work has had great impact for cancer patients and their families, it carries over into how we see the world as well. We all carry with us a set of stories that shape how we see the world. Some are from our family experience, some from how we have experienced the world, and some from our faith communities. When we tell those stories and we know that they are heard, it creates a place of growth and for many healing. When we build relationships with people, regardless of what they do or do not believe about faith, we are able to build communities. When we build communities based on relationships with one another, we begin to cultivate that common ground that lies between us. When we work at this, we can create safe spaces for people to de-thorn the thorniness of their lives, to cast out rocks of brokenness, and to heal. When this kind of deep healing happens, the soil becomes fertile ground for a life of faith. A life that is centered not in caring for oneself or one's family, but for the community in which we find ourselves. What is the woundedness in us that needs healing? And what is the woundedness in our communities, our relationships, and our world? It gets a little tricky when we think about all the places the wounds can be hiding, and if we're really honest, it's our own wounds that are sometimes the hardest to find. The beautiful thing about community is that we are not alone in tending to our own brokenness. We have folks walking alongside us who understand just what it means to be broken. We have each other to be reminded of the healing that can take place deep within us, because God has given freely of God's own grace. God has given Jesus, who has taught us how to love. We can get out into our communities and help heal the wounds of the world, too, by being willing to listen to people, by being able to hear them, and try to understand what it must be like to be in their shoes. Part of a seminary education is called field education. This is where we get to go out into the world and get our hands dirty, while learning about being an effective leader with healthy boundaries. During my senior year, I was placed in an agency that served a population of underserved folks who live in an economically challenged area of Louisville, Kentucky. I went in with some ideas about the cyclical nature of poverty. Then I started listening to the stories of the clients who came in for their once-a-month bag of food and items of clothing. Now, there were all sorts of people who came in, but as their stories were heard by the volunteers each week, we were able to get past "this is a client" and start seeing the fully human being standing there before us. The loved child of God who, just like me, has places of brokenness, thorns that threaten to choke the very life out of us. Another layer of wounds comes out of these stories, too. You begin to see where the very systems that were put in place to help catch a family who fell on hard times failed the family. You start to see the struggle for the single parent who wants desperately to go to school so they can provide for their children, but they are met with obstacles that are often insurmountable, and hope is lost. When we cultivate the ground is broken open and turned over so that it can provide a resting place for the seed and nourishment as it takes root and grows into a strong plant that will later bear more fruit, which will bear more seeds, and the process can begin again. This takes a great deal of vulnerability and trust. When we share our stories, this takes a great deal of vulnerability and trust when we share our stories, and is precisely why community is so important. When we take the time to build real relationships, a community with depth can form. This is the kind of community that allows us to be vulnerable and share our doubts, our fears, our deep wounds. We can share our worries about life and our concerns for the world and be met with empathy and compassion. From that place, we can find ways to help the world heal and to bring justice to all who suffer, wholeness to all who are broken, and maybe, if we dare to dream big, peace to a broken, wounded, and violent world. The really good news is we aren't going it alone. God is at work with us. Not only does God sow these seeds generously for all people, in our reading from Isaiah, we see that God is also going to provide the rain to make sure the seeds have the water they need so that they can sprout and bring forth bread. That they will go out in joy and be led back in peace, that thorns will begin to come up as the cypress trees. The earth itself will celebrate. We are called to work alongside God so that we can cultivate the soil in our communities and bring into reality God's dream for our world. Will you let me hear your story? To be one who casts out your rocks and files down your thorns. Will you be one to cast out my rocks and file down my thorns? Will you do it for the person sitting next to you? The person serving your lunch? For the person on the corner begging for change? The question is not what kind of soil are you, but rather, what kind of soil are you willing to cultivate in the world as you encounter it? Are you willing in your life of faith to be one who sifts out the rocks and files down the thorns of our sacred stories? To walk with God, cultivating the soil around us as God sows the seeds of love and grace.